Joining us now to talk about all this is our friend Judy Miller. And Judy Miller, of course, now Manhattan Institute fellow, Newsmax contributor, wrote a great piece for Newsmax called Obama's AP Probe Sets Dangerous Precedent. And Judy, welcome again.
Hi, how are you?
Great, great. And of course, we need to point out, to put this in context, that you spent 85 days in jail in 2005 for protecting your sources, and you had your telephone records seized and tried to prevent it, and was unsuccessful in 2006. So with that as the backdrop, what do you make of what we now know after Carney and Holder?
Well, I think this is truly an astonishing development. What it means is that the most massive document seizure of a news organization in history was authorized by a deputy attorney general because for some inexplicable reason, the attorney general himself was interviewed by the FBI in connection with this criminal investigation. It boggles the mind.
Yeah. We're talking about James Cole, who went ahead and got the subpoena supposedly, but I still can't figure out why the Attorney General, if this was about a plot to bomb an airliner, and as we heard yesterday or speculated yesterday when the story first broke, it was reported that the AP had agreed to withhold the story until the case was broken, and then the White House wanted them, or someone wanted them, to hold it even longer, and at that point they said no. So I don't. Well,
according to the AP, the reason they didn't want to hold it is that it was the White House's desire to present the information once the threat to national security had passed.
Right.
And that doesn't pass the smell test. I mean, what they basically said is, now that you've played ball with us, you're not going to get the story that you had before anybody else had it. Because we want to present it.
And how is it a national? I mean,
I'm confused. According to, by the way, Steve, this is according to the AP.
Right.
I mean, that's their version.
And I'm confused because if the case had been busted, and the New York Times then the AP wanted to then run the story, when did they initiate these phone records purge? Was it while the threat still existed? After the threat ended? I mean, we don't even know, right?
Look, what we do know is that after the government seizes records in this fashion, rather than go to an individual and say, we want your telephone records, and then you start negotiating. Once it's done that, it has 90 days to notify the news organization that this is what it's done. So it really means that all of this has happened within fairly recently.
Yeah.
No. So that the plot thickens is all we can say.
Right, and this Holder thing is really bizarre. I want to get to your piece and the points you make, but let's listen, Chad, to Eric Holder. He talks about two aspects here. Let's give a listen.
2012, that I'd been interviewed by the FBI in connection with this matter, and to avoid a potential. The appearance of a potential conflict of interest, and to make sure that the investigation was seen as independent, I recused myself from this matter. We'll get to you exactly when that happened. It was early on in the investigation. This matter has thereafter been conducted by the U.S. Attorney here in Washington, D.C., under the supervision of the Deputy Attorney General. The Deputy Attorney General would have been the one who ultimately had to authorize the subpoena that went to the AP. This was a very serious leak, and a very, very serious leak. I've been a prosecutor since 1976, and I have to say that this is among, if not the most serious, it is within the top 2 or 3 most serious leaks that I've ever seen. It put the American people at risk, and that is not hyperbole. It put the American people at risk.
All right. What do you make of all this?
Well, clearly, if you had just sanctioned, or if you had not disapproved a telephone seizure records of this kind, you would want to stress that the reason you had done it was national security and a real and present threat. It's just very hard for an outsider looking at the story that the AP wrote and looking at the scope of this request that an outsider would come to the conclusion that such a request was justified. Look, they not only got the records of the 5 individuals who were involved in reporting the May 7th story, they also got the telephone records of everyone who was in one of those main offices at the AP, who was at the House Gallery. Reporters go,
Yeah.
AP reporters go in and out of there. They got home, cell, office, and these office records, and the AP estimates loosely, they're not sure yet how many people were compromised, records were compromised, but they assume it could be as many as 100. It's very hard to imagine that 100 people should have their privacy invaded, their records compromised by a leak. I mean, it could happen. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm not saying it wasn't justified, but by what we know now, all we know is that it is this kind of a seizure is unprecedented in American history. So all I can say is they better have a darn good reason for having done it,
All right.
and I haven't seen it yet.
Well, okay, and the fact that the Attorney General says that it wasn't him who signed the subpoena makes it even more egregious in your view, and in my view as well, that a second level, so to speak, a person could conduct this. And the White House, claims ignorance. They claimed ignorance on the IRS. They claimed ignorance with this. I know the Justice Department is independent, but it wasn't the White House being investigated here. I mean, how is it possible that the White House had no inkling of this?
If it was, that's another thing that doesn't compute.
I mean, this is the greatest leak.
This is the greatest. This leak.
Right, the greatest leak in our history.
Threat,
yeah.
One of the greatest threats he's ever seen. How is it possible that no one at the White House knew about it?
Well,
how is it possible that it wouldn't rise to the level of the White House or Jay Carney or the president if it's so serious? There's just a lot that doesn't make sense here. And Steve, coming on the heels of the Benghazi fiasco and the IRS scandal, which the president himself pronounced outrageous, this administration's credibility is not high at the moment. So I hope that they're going to start releasing information about this quickly, because at the moment, reporters just have a lot of very legitimate questions to ask.
We're talking to Judy Miller here on the Steve Malzberg Show. When you heard this story break yesterday, I know you immediately started research and started writing this great piece that's at Newsmax.com, but you had to harken back to your own situation and your own time in jail and your own personal records, no?
Well, yes. Well, while I was in jail and while I was fighting to stay out of jail, and even after I came out of jail, we were still arguing over whether or not the government would get my records, my telephone records, cell, home, and office in a totally separate leak investigation. So this went on for years, and in the end, because of the 2-to-1 ruling in a federal district court, we lost. So the New York Times records and mine and that of Phil Sheenan, my colleague at the Times, all of our records went over to the Justice Department, and nothing ever came of it except that our privacy and our ability to work as journalists was made more difficult.
All right, so let me ask you. I know you're not an attorney, at least not that I know of. Okay.
Not even honorary.
Okay. What were besides the fact that it seems like an outrage on the surface and unprecedented, as you put it, certainly, do you believe that laws were broken here?
I don't know. I think it's much too early to say anything like that. And, I'm certain that the Attorney General did whatever he did, advised by legal counsel, since he has access to lawyers.
Yeah.
I don't think we know yet. Just as I don't think we know whether or not the changes that were made to the talking points were made for reasons of bureaucratic butt covering or to change a political narrative. We just don't know. These are questions that journalists should be asking, that many mainstream reporters haven't been asking, but I think that now, because of events like this, they're being forced to ask, and I'm glad they're asking.
And the IRS, we haven't touched on that yet.
Well, that's just scandalous, and the president himself had to say he was outraged by it. I'm glad, by the way, the president said that. I think that Susan Collins was right, that he had to address that issue personally. This is one of these institutions that Americans turn to with trust and confidence that records and sensitive information will not be abused or shared or misused, and this was a blatant example of it. But even here, we have an instance in which initially the department, the agency, tried to fob this off as being the work of low-level employees,
right,
but
yeah.
It turns out that supervisors knew about it for some time, and once again, more questions need to be asked.
Yeah, and again, when the White House says, the president found out about yesterday's events on the plane when the news broke, and when they say that the president found out about the IRS scandal, quote unquote, that's my terminology, through the news on Friday, like everybody else, when that's been, as we find out now, like you said, going on for years, and someone in the White House did have knowledge of it. It never got to the president, but someone in the White House counsel did know that this was a problem. So, I mean, it just seems to me, as granted an Obama critic, but even as a person with common sense, how could higher level people in the White House, maybe even the president, not have an inkling of these things?
Well, the president is a busy person, and
I know golf and basketball. I understand.
No, I mean, it's easy to take pot shots at that, and I'm glad he's getting a little relaxation. But these are terribly difficult jobs, crammed with literally, issues of grave national security, of international relations, of domestic tranquility, and it's very hard to say he ought to be aware of everything. But in an instance like this, with respect to the AP,
right,
when you have a precedent-making seizure with no effort to try and secure the news organization's cooperation in advance, when you take this draconian step, I think I would have felt better personally if someone at the White House had at least been aware of it.
Absolutely. All right, Judy, thank you so much. Appreciate it as always.
Thank you, Steve.
Take care. Bye-bye. Judy Miller, ladies and gentlemen. Read her piece at newsmax.com.